when people ask, well, why women's history? Why women specifically, and why history? And the idea is those days where you look up and you see the moon and there's only half of it. You know, the other half isn't gone, right? There's not just half a moon in the sky. It's just not illuminated on that particular night, right? So we think of women's history like that. We think of women's history is that side of the moon that isn't always illuminated. So many people in history, a lot of them dudes, but not all of them, are on that side that is always illuminated. It's the people we hear about all the time, right? But that other side of history, those names and those stories, they're always there. We just don't always shine a spotlight on them.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told. And today I invite you to join me in conversation with Leah Leach as we take a communication perspective on highlighting the stories, experiences, and lives of women in history and now. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. By this, I just mean that we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. Whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Leah Leach. She is the founder of Gals Guide, the first women's history lending library in the United States, also one of the hosts of the Gals Guide podcast. This conversation is the second for our March series, all about taking a communication perspective on the stories of women. In the United States, March is Women's History Month, and just a few days ago, on March 8th, it was International Women's Day. This is a great opportunity to really shine some light on women, our lives, and our contributions, which is what Leah's work is about. We're going to hear about that today, but for Leah, it's not just during one month or one day of the year. This conversation revolves around us asking how we can better educate ourselves on the stories of women in history all the time. Stories of women. You'll hear Leah and I get into all of this today. So let's jump right in with Leah. Hi, Leah. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. I'm excited.
So looking forward to this conversation and excited to hear more about the work that you do. You and I are located not that far apart. You are in Noblesville, Indiana, which is where I grew up, but now I am just down the road in Indianapolis. And I'm newer to the work that you're doing, but I know you've been around for a long time, so I'm excited to hear about that today. But before I get too ahead of myself, let's start with you. Share a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. I like to say I'm a Thomas. I'm a very useful engine. I tried to be very much a betterment to myself and to those around me, but I'm also a very serendipitous learner. Serendipity is like one of my favorite words. Mm-hmm. I'm a women's history storyteller, and I'm also the founder of the Gals Guide Library. I'm really passionate about learning from others about how to be a good person. I think if you kind of boil down all the different things that I have kind of done, it usually always has a little seed of that to it. I've also been a Buddhist, a practicing Buddhist for the last 30 years. So this has shaped a lot of my mindfulness. It has also helped me kind of understand my experiences, especially because I actually had a very traumatic childhood. So Buddhism and finding the joy and the mindfulness and the turning terrible things into positive lessons has been really helpful. I'm also a wife of a very supportive dude. Love him tremendously. I'm decided to keep him. And we survived living in Los Angeles together. We survived moving cross country. We even survived a war. He was an active military member of the Army. I had a film career for a while. I founded a library, which is a very silly adventure for us to do together. And we've also raised two incredibly wonderful, kind children. So that is kind of me in a nutshell, if you will.
Yes, it's a great place to start. I usually kind of give the disclaimer of like, I know it's so much to ask. To be like, okay, who are you? You have, 2 minutes, go. But it's good to give us a little taste. I'm sure more stories will come out as we continue to talk. And yeah, we're all just made of many, many stories. So let's just see which ones we can get into today.
Exactly.
But that is a great place to start. So, okay, now that you've introduced yourself, introduce your work a little bit. I want to know all about everything to do with Gal's Guide.
Gal's Guide is quite fun. It is the first women's history lending library in the country. And when we started out and when we were collecting books to open a women's history library, we didn't realize we would be the first in the country. And frankly, we were disappointed that we were the first.
That is shocking to me.
I know. 2019 is when we started gathering books, and we're like, what do you mean you can't lend or borrow books that are women's focus? The locations that are in the United States are very much attached to universities. And sometimes you have to be a student, but sometimes you don't. But it still is a situation where you can't browse the stacks and you can't necessarily check anything out.
Wow.
You have to tell the librarians what you'd like. They send you to a little room. Then they bring you the books that you have asked for. You get to sit with your little books for as long as they are open on that particular day. And then they take them away. And we're like, but no, that's not what you think of when you think of a library. Yeah. So we wanted to mirror the public library, but we want it to be female focused. So all of the books that we have in our collection right now, there is 6,212 books. I recently found them for our numbers in the library that are either written by women or about women. And that is a growing collection. I think every year we have more 1,000 books that actually get added to the collection, which is fantastic. And then the library collection, the borrowing and acquiring books and preserving books and giving them really kind of like a vehicle of awesomeness. We have events that focus around books and women of history. So we have a book club, but then we also have a film club because maybe reading isn't your cup of tea and you learn better visually. So we look at films that are either fiction or nonfiction that kind of delve into women's history or at least a strong female character to have that discussion. But then we also have a walking club where we talk about women of history. We have an LGBTQ club, and we even have a Buddhism club as well, where we focus on the feminine part of Buddhism, which is rarely talked about.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Oh, we also have a podcast as well. So that's why I'm totally at home talking with you today.
Yes.
We're in our 7th season, and our podcast is really cute. The idea is 4 women get together. We have a theme that we're kind of like looking at that particular month. And each woman brings to the table somebody amazing that they found throughout history. And we're drinking. And it's not a thesis statement. And we just share somebody that we found really, really cool with the other ladies at the table. So then when listeners tune in, it feels like they're just kind of listening to this cool a group of gals who are just having a great time learning about somebody new and discussing it. So I dig it.
Yeah. Well, all of that is so incredible and just wow to me. And I love that it sounds so simple to say, let's just get together and talk about a woman.
Right.
And yet how revolutionary.
Right. Exactly.
How important, I think, is what I really want to say to just, hear the stories of actual women. And so that's cool that you do that through not only the podcast, but having the library full of the books where people can learn.
Yeah, it's that idea of women of history, especially the farther back in history you go, what they accomplished with fewer resources than what we have today. So imagine what we have today, but learning from these women, their struggles, their mindset, what they were up against. And, taking a piece of that into our everyday life. Imagine what we could do.
Yeah. I'm so curious about, you said, what a crazy thing to do to start a library.
Oh, it is. Oh, yeah.
I'm so curious about that process, maybe specifically about almost like your internal process of like, what kind of thoughts were you having? What kind of feelings were you having as you pursued creating this library?
It started with the even before it started as a library, I was having just women come into my living room, and we had a women's group that we just kind of talked. We were first called Women Empowering Balance. We thought that there was this idea that there was balance out there somewhere, and we were just missing it.
Mm.
We weren't doing balance right. So we were getting together and we were talking about, okay, what is missing? What are the hurdles? What are we struggling with? And we would talk about different aspects of, anything from makeup to self-care to movies and how they portray women. But one thing that kept coming up was role models. So if we had a fantastic mom, we had one role model, and that kind of gave us a little bit of a foundation of what to do and what to look for in life. But if we had a broken or problematic or non-existent mother, we were totally lost on role models of how to navigate life. So we started learning about women of history just as that idea of what did somebody else do? Like, how did they survive this particular industry or this particular mindset or this past? So we started there. And as we were doing this in my living room, with like anywhere from 5 to 15 of us, suddenly we need to get this out to more people. It can't just be in this little tiny space. Let's do a podcast. So let's do a podcast so we still have this to share with each other, but then also it can be ripples out into the world and more people can hear about these amazing women. So as we're doing this podcast, we start to run into books that are out of print, that are out of circulation, that are amazing books. The one that really kind of, I guess, broke me in a good way was we were researching Conchita Cintrón. And she was a female bullfighter. She was born in Peru, and she fought in bull matches all around the world, including the United States, but mostly in Spain, as where a lot of bullfighting in the early kind of 1900s was. And her memoir was translated into 7 languages, and it had a foreword by Orson Welles. And we couldn't find it anywhere.
Wow.
In any language, in any version, we couldn't find it. And I went, why? Why can't we find this? They called her the goddess of the bull ring. And she even talked about how bullfighting was totally this metaphor for life and solving problems. And it was eye-opening and awakening. And this information was gone.
Yeah.
And so that's when I turned to my best friend, Katie and Bonnie, and I said, would it be crazy if we started a library and started collecting these books so we could share them with other podcasters and other historians? Because it seems like no one's trying to hold on to this stuff.
Yeah.
And so we all agreed that it was crazy, but we would do it anyway. So that's kind of how it started. It started with what are the podcast episodes that we wanted to do, but we couldn't find enough information. We couldn't find a book or a documentary or enough of a Wikipedia article, for crying out loud, to even fill an episode. If you can't fill an episode, then that means there's more digging to be done. There's more finding out about this person of history. And so that's kind of where we started. And we started asking people if they would donate books from their collection, that we would start compiling them, all of the books, while looking for a space. And finding a space, oh my goodness. I didn't think that was going to be that hard, but it was. We were even trying to find a space for 1 month. We wanted 1 month to open up a pop-up for the month of March, because Women's History Month, right?
Yes. Hello.
We thought, March, somebody give us one little space. Like, it doesn't need to be that big. You know what I mean? Like a tent space, if you will, like a 10 by 10 room. And we'll prove this concept, and we'll prove that people would love to interact with women's history and books in a very cool way. And we were talking to mayors, and we were talking to cities, and we were talking to real estate agents that are like, do you have a building that won't sell? Can we pay you for a month? We were trying everything to finally find a location. At the time, it was it was 2019, kind of 2018. It was right in that kind of vein. And I was on Pantsuit Nation because, politics.
Yeah.
So I was on Pantsuit Nation, and I saw all these encouraging stories of people, living their life dream. And I was all ready to send out this post that said, you know what? I couldn't find a location for my library. And I really, really tried, but I'm so glad that I tried anyway. And it was this really heartfelt, like, don't give up on your dreams, but sometimes they just don't come true when you need them to come true. March is right around the corner and I'm not going to be able to do it this year. And it was a woe is me. And as I'm about to hit send, I got an email that a location opened up where we are right now.
Wow.
And so I changed that post to, so never give up on your dreams. Because sometimes when you give up on your dreams, suddenly the universe says, okay, fine, if you want it bad enough.
Wow.
And so we are inside Noblesville Creates, which is a basically kind of like art sharing space where you can have your own space and you basically are a not a lender. What's the word I'm looking for? You lease a space. We're an artist space.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, will you take us in even though we're a literary art?
Yeah. Right.
And they were all about it. So
Great.
we have had a fantastic home at Noblesville Creates among a whole bunch of really, really talented artists, oil painters, as well as watercolorists. Even a few sculptors and bookbinders have been in this space throughout the years, too. So it's a really nice creative space to be.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so neat. One of the things I'm hearing from your story is that, first of all, 7 years of a podcast. And guess what? You haven't run out of women to talk about.
Never. And I don't think we will, because
I don't think you will.
every month we look at it like we're doing an around the world tour right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm prepping actually for our Irish gals story. And I have like 5 options. I only get to pick one.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, that's just like surface level 5 amazing options of Irish women who are inspiring me, let alone the ones that are like, okay, I can do this again and again and again.
Mm-hmm.
It's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when I think about that, to say, okay, there's plenty of women out there to talk about, to learn about. And when you say there's not stories about them, or there's not, books, at least, that were in circulation at that time, that is not to say that the stories and the women do not exist. So it's more about like access to information than there not being great female role models out there.
Right. They're not being spotlighted or showcased or highlighted in that particular way, but they're out there. They're just kind of waiting in the shadows for us to shine a spotlight on them. Yeah.
Yes. And not to go cheesy, but I'll say knowledge is power. And I'm relating to kind of your mission in that my hope for this podcast is all kind of about accessibility, really. In that my taking a communication perspective is what I call that. And I'll, explain a little more about how I'm kind of using that to approach this conversation. But that's what I studied in school. I went to Ball State. So, also in Indiana and Muncie.
That's where my daughter is right now. My oldest daughter is at Ball State. She's pre-med.
I loved it. It was great. And I studied interpersonal communication. And I'm sitting in those classes, which it was just so transformative. And it's such important information. And I just remember sitting there being like, why does everybody not know this stuff?
Right.
I'm sitting in my like intro to interpersonal communication class. I'm like, this is the class that should be mandated. Okay, everybody takes public speaking. Sure. Everybody takes finance 101, whatever. Everyone should be taking this class. It's ridiculous that we just assume that people will stumble their way into healthy communication patterns.
And it's when it's something we use all the time too, right?
Yes.
Communication. It's the forefront of our life. Yeah.
Yeah. And people think that it's just kind of abstract thing, but really like there's plenty of people who have studied it forever. And there's so many great theories and tools and language around it that can help you understand what is actually happening. And an important part of it to me is to then, make new choices in your communicating that actually serves you. And so I love hearing what you're saying about these stories and what it's meant to you. And I'm excited to hear more about, the impacts that you've seen it have on other people. Because when I talk about a communication perspective, what I'm really getting at is that in our communication, we are using stories. And in the stories, we are making meaning. That's kind of the key part of it. That I, in my opinion, at least, that is, the difference between not using a communication perspective and using a communication perspective is looking through this lens and thinking about the meaning that's being made in the stories that we're telling. And so that's why it feels so important, the work that you do, because if you're never hearing stories of women, then that's going to shape the meaning that you make around what's possible for yourself or what it means to, quote, be a woman, like whatever, fill in the blank with the meaning that could be made around that. But that, I just, so like, step one being like just access. feels really
Yes.
important
To
and
have
powerful.
the content, the resources, to be able to have it in variety of different mediums as well, but also to make it interesting. One of the first early on things when I said, well, I was going to start a women's history library, people were like, history is boring. So it wasn't anything, at least it wasn't anything sexist, right? But it was just an overall blanketed statement of, yeah, but history is boring. And I'm like, well, then you've been learning it wrong. Because it's not about names and dates and locations. It's about, what did this human being do? And how can you then encourage that or learn from that or patchwork that into your life? Here's an example of what to do or what not to do. And both are just as valuable to learn from to be a better human being.
Yes. And to go kind of, history broadly, yes, so important for learning lessons. And then also on a maybe more individual level, this is how I think about it from my communication perspective, so important to reflect and think about the patterns and how did you get where you are? And then, because then that in turn can help you decide, where do I want to go?
Right.
And what do I want to be doing right now so that I get where I want to go? And also, what new stories do I want to be telling? I think the part for me that's so important around stories and meaning is that you kind of question the stories that you're told and the meaning that has been made, because you take that for granted. For example, I think about this a lot, that I grew up with this kind of understanding of like, okay, there's good and bad and right and wrong. And it's very simple. And there wasn't a lot of conversation or questioning around like where meaning came from. So that was the idea that really kind of hooked me on this communication perspective, to say that, wait a second, I can actually be more thoughtful about the meaning. I can ask questions of it. I can look into it. I can dig deeper. And then also I can make new meaning. I'm not just, at the whim of, the meaning that has already been made. I'm not powerless to it.
You can think for yourself. I have a great example that actually just happened recently, within like the last month. I was researching the Agoge. The Agoge were the female warriors in Africa, in Benin, in Dahomey. Sometimes they're called the Dahomey warriors. Yes, they are the inspiration for the Black Panthers' Dorje Melange. They are the real life female warrior tribe. And one thing, as I'm doing this research, I'm really looking at it and I'm realizing it's written by colonizers. It's written by the white dudes that found them and their observations of the idea of women warriors, which is completely different from how they saw themselves. So I had to look at, this is what I'm reading. I'm reading about, a Western ideal, a European ideal of what they are experiencing and what they are. But I also have to tap into my own womanness, to my own experiences, to feel a little bit, to add that little tinge to, but a warrior tribe of women, what would that feel like? How empowering would that be? How terrifying would that be? But also, how protective would that be? So it was those little nuances that I don't think the dudes that I was reading from were necessarily thinking about.
Yeah. That, I'm glad you bring that up. I just listened to that episode of your podcast and was, so again, I just learning how wonderful to learn things you didn't know before. And something I appreciated is that, you, I think, kind of did right by the story to try to bring in as many different perspectives as possible, not like kind of you're saying, take it as the story, the capital T, capital T, capital S, the story that the colonizers are telling, but also you acknowledge like, okay, yes, awesome, badass group of women warriors, not perfect. You're telling their whole story. You talk about how they
were part of the slave trade.
Right. Yeah. They like imprisoned their enemies and sold them into slavery. And so I
get more weapons so that they could battle more. And it's like, I get it, but I also get it.
Yes. And I'm glad that you say that, because that's not to say that the work you're doing is just like women are perfect all the time. Like, I just think
none of us are perfect, right? Yes. We're all a work in progress. So
yeah. And I think where like gender norms and gender roles come from are a kind of narrow understanding of women, for example, and men, I think they get
Yep.
a narrow end of the deal too. Unfair to everybody, every gender.
Yeah.
And so I think you don't combat a simplified story with a simplified story. You know, you are like what I would call complicating the narrative. And I think there's so much value in that.
And it allows us to be perfectly imperfect too. Because we all have bad days.
Yes.
So, and we get to have those because those bad days, we learn from it. And those choices that we take, we learn from it. We are complicated beings. And the idea of, are we trying to be better for it? Well, we have to experience some really crappy things to be able to be better.
Yeah.
If everything is wonderful, then how are you wonderful all the time? You know what I mean? It's kind of that. That Oberus story sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're dancing around it, but I want to just give it to you as an outright question to hear what you have to say. I, kind of have my own answers in my head to the question of, why does it matter to tell women's stories and to highlight women's storytelling? Yeah. I think we're kind of dancing around our answers to that. But again, I just want to give it back to you to give you a chance to say anything we haven't said yet.
It is honestly, the why is the most exciting part. It's where I get very excited. I get very passionate, and I have a 2-part answer. I get that excited.
Bring it on.
About all of it. So the first part of why I get so excited of what I do, and I tie it into a metaphor because I love tying like anything into a metaphor. I mean, not only do I love metaphors, but this one's space related. And our full IRS name is Gal's Guide to the Galaxy. Somebody told us, well, many people told us it was too many G's. And I'm like, really? Okay. So we're Gal's Guide Library to kind of shorten it. But, IRS-ness, we love the galaxies. Not only that, we love the irreverence of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is where our name comes from. The idea, the meaning of life is 42. We just loved that amount of quirky silliness, but anything space as well. So the metaphor I use of when people ask, well, why women's history? Why women specifically, and why history? And the idea is, on a non-cloudy night in Indiana, that's very difficult. You know this.
Yeah, right.
When you can actually look up and see the moon, right? On those actual days. And those days where you look up and you see the moon and there's only half of it. The other half isn't gone, right? There's not just half a moon in the sky. It's just not illuminated on that particular night, right? So we think of women's history like that. We think of women's history is that side of the moon that isn't always illuminated. So many people in history, a lot of them dudes, but not all of them, are on that side that is always illuminated. It's the people we hear about all the time, right? But that other side of history, those names and those stories, they're always there. We just don't always shine a spotlight on them. So that's what Gal's Guide does. We kind of just turn that focus to that dark side of the moon. And there's lots of Pink Floyd references you could easily, do in there. To the women who thought, I can do something about this. I can make this a little bit better. Those little inventors that think what they're doing is just helping things like a windshield wiper, or they're helping things that invent Wi-Fi, or they're helping things that invent rock and roll. They're just doing those things that just a little bit different. And you start to realize the connection through that, just doing something a little bit differently. So one of my favorite all time to bring this point is Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Have you ever heard of Sister Rosetta Tharpe?
I have not.
She is my favorite. She invented rock and roll. She is a gay Black woman who does not get credit for inventing rock and roll by some, but word is kind of getting out there. She is a woman who played rhythm and blues with an electric guitar and started speeding it up and speeding it up. She was the #1 gospel singer of her time in the 1930s. And then she sang a song called Rock Me. And it was about Jesus, but it also wasn't about Jesus. And in that was written a review. Maurice Modenkirk wrote a review and said that Sister Rosetta Tharpe's song Rock Me had this rock and roll quality to it. And it was the first time that word was ever used. It was used 20 years before Alan Freed on the radio in Ohio used it to
Wow.
describe a Little Richard, or to, by the way, Little Richard's sister Rosetta Tharpe found him.
Wow.
He was playing her songs in a nightclub. He was 14. And she said, honey, you have to tour with me.
Wow.
Also, Elvis went to see her play, but that's a whole other story. But you start to get these connectors who invent things. Alice Guy Blanchet created the first narrative film on her lunch break when the Lumiere brothers brought in a camera and said, we don't know what to do with this. And she said, can I practice with it? Can I play with it? And she made The Cabbage Fairy, which is the first short film that is a story that is not just trains going by and people leaving an office.
Wow.
You know, just inventing movies, you know, and music videos. She also invented music videos as well. And then you also get things like Miyazaki Shikibu. She wrote the first printed novel. And we're talking in the year 1000 AD.
Wow.
Miyazaki wrote this book. You also then can connect later to Mary Shelley, who invented entire genre of horror with Frankenstein. So you get these little connections throughout the world that kind of make our world a better place by women just saying, I think I can do it better, or I think I can do it differently, and not claiming it, not having this PR campaign of this is mine. And you all shall know my name. Sister Rosetta Tharpe was buried without a tombstone. They didn't know who she was or where she was buried for decades. We forgot about her until a researcher wrote a book about her.
Wow.
And it wasn't me, by the way. It was Gail Shield. But yes. And so that's the first reason why I get so passionate about what I do, because I find these stories and I'm so moved by them. But the second reason is that when Gal's Guide shares these stories, it shows this connecting rod for empathy-based communication. And that's really what Gal's Guide does. It's not names and dates. It's really about that empathy-based communication. It's that, what obstacles did this woman overcome? What wisdom did she spread to others? So one example of this is when you hear about geniuses, when you hear about the Henry Fords of the world and the Steve Jobs, like, they're geniuses, right? Like, you can't touch the genius that they have. No matter what you do, you will never be as smart or as innovative as some of these geniuses of our time. But when you hear about Marie Curie, right? Or Julia Child, or even back to Mary Shelley, when you hear about them and you hear about their work, you're almost inclined to like, I could try that. I could give that a spin. Julia Child is famous for messing up a potato dish live on television. She turned one potato dish into another potato dish, and then she said, failure is the only way to learn how to cook. That is endearing to people. It's sharing her knowledge in a way so that other people were encouraged to try it. And that is really that feminine power. Because feminine power, it's not exerted over another being. It's shared. It's not better than. It's not worse than. It's just about sharing something. It's another example, because I love my metaphors, is a closed fist versus an open hand. So if history is taught and it's like a closed fist and it's like, these are the names, these are the dates, these are the things you have to memorize, it's very hard to like grasp those things very tightly with that closed fist. But if you open your, I would also say, when you have a closed fist, you leave people out. You leave out the marginalized people in society many, many times with that closed fist, because it's only these certain things that you can touch on. But if you teach history with an open hand, the idea of giving freely, that this is their story, what does this percolate in you? How does this affect you? What similarities do you find in your own journey? What wisdom can you find in this story? Then these stories become ingrained in us and they last a lifetime, and we can't stop telling them because they're almost part of us. So that's the second reason why Gal's Guide teaches history and why I get so excited about it as well.
I just think people deserve to have, again, I'll go back to access, access to as many different stories as possible because, like you're saying, then you have so many ideas of what your life could be.
Yeah.
So, the less stories you have, the less maybe imagination you have about what your life could be. Because if you've never seen it before, that's really hard to imagine something you've, never heard a story of before.
I started my early life in filmmaking, and the first thing I saw on screen was actresses. That's what you see when you go to the movies, right? Is actresses. So I wanted to be an actress. My father said no in a very crude way, which kind of made me like, okay, so maybe not in front of the camera. What is behind it? So then I had to learn what were the people behind the camera. I didn't see many female filmmakers when I was growing up. But when I was kind of really trying to look at colleges and universities, I was around like 15. I saw Penny Marshall on Entertainment Tonight talking about directing A League of Their Own. And I saw her direct Tom Hanks. And more importantly, to my 15-year-old self, I saw her direct Madonna. And Madonna was a big deal to me. And to see a woman not tell Madonna what to do, but tell Madonna what to do was like, this is a job? Wait a minute. I could be a director. I thought it was that geniusness, that Spielberg, that Scorsese, that, okay, cool. That's not for me. I need to be a script girl, right? I need to be a costume designer. I need to be somewhere in that female realm. But seeing Penny do it opened that up to, this is a possibility for me.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard, but it's a possibility. And I can look for other women in the room who are also trying for this possibility. So it helps. It really does.
Yeah. Yeah. And to take us back to your moon metaphor for a second, it sparked a metaphor of my own that's adjacent to what you're saying, basically.
Yes.
But I'm remembering I had the opportunity to travel to Spain in 2022, and I was in what I would call the middle of nowhere. And it was like, there were like 4 planets were aligning one night. It was special. We were going to get up early and the planets were great. But oh my God, I have never seen so many stars in my life.
Right.
And it's because I was somewhere that had literally zero light pollution and I could see so many stars and it was so beautiful. And so that's my thought too, of like, those stars are always there.
They're always there.
But if
they're hidden in plain sight,
you're not seeing them at all.
Yeah.
And that as, my metaphor for like women's stories and women in history, women in every single space, they are always there. But are you seeing them or not? Are you recognizing them or not?
And they're waiting. They're waiting for you to find them. They're like, well, I lived this whole life and I help.
Yeah. And they're beautiful and you want to see them. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very wonderful. But yeah, no, that is a perfect metaphor of it, of a different space, feeling, time, energy, and just being able to see the thing that you need to see at the right time. That's that serendipitousness.
Yeah. Right.
And it really sticks with you because you're like, wait a minute, this is not like any other thing I've learned or place I've gone or experience I've experienced. And you remember that for the rest of your life. For that history test, not so much.
Not so much. I'm curious to know more about serendipity for you. It's making me think of a concept. So my communication perspective, I kind of use that language again in the hopes of like being more accessible. It really comes from a communication theory called coordinated management of meaning, CMM for short. And three important facets of that theory are coherence, coordination, and mystery. And that's what I'm hearing when you talk about serendipity in your life, that you do actually have to leave room for mystery. The way that it's kind of explained is coherence is the sense making. That's how we tell, why we tell stories. We're looking to make things coherent. And then the coordination is that we have to do that in relationships. And so we have to coordinate with each other. We have to collaborate with each other. And then like everything else outside of that cannot be made sense of, there's mystery. And it's important to leave room for mystery and leave room for another word that we use is emergence. What's going to emerge is going to emerge. That really informs the way that I approach these podcasts. The very first podcast episodes I did, I sent my guests like 10 questions. As you know, I sent you 3 in advance. Yes. I still think people like to be prepared a little bit. Right. But that way there's room for emergence and the conversation can happen and can breathe.
Yes, absolutely. In Buddhism, a lot of the times the word we use is expanse. That everything is expansive and there's so much. If you think of space, there is no edge and there is no center. And
Mm,
so that idea, it can be terrifying to some of the idea of everything just keeps going and going.
right.
But
Sure.
that's history, right? Even before we
Mm,
wrote it down.
great point.
It's always out there. And so some of the things, because we've been telling each other stories longer than we've been writing them down. So
Hmm.
we are very pre-wired for those facial cues and body languages and nuances of words and meaning and translation more than reading the written word. So it's that not only reading it, but also how do you evoke it into your being that is a more expansive is where
Yeah.
I was going. Yeah.
Hmm. I did not know that. So again, learning so much today. Thank you for that. And cool that you just use that language, because as I was thinking about this conversation, one of the things that I was reflecting on is that as we make meaning, as we tell stories, I think that stories are less helpful, maybe, when they're prescriptive. That was kind of the idea that I've been
Yeah.
reflecting on. You know, when this
Yeah.
is how you have to be
Yeah.
prescriptive,
Rules.
telling you how
Closed
to be.
fist once again. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, a closed
Hmm.
fist version of a story. And as I was thinking about that, I
Yeah.
was like, well, what's the opposite to that? Or what's a,
Hmm.
what's something else? And the word that came to me was like, I want stories that are expansive. And I
Yes.
kind of like, I thought, I was like,
Hmm.
that's maybe not, a direct opposite, or I don't fully, understand what I meant by that, but it's cool to hear you talk about
Yeah.
expansiveness being so important in the space of Buddhism. And I think it's important in the space of, the way
Hmm.
we relate to our stories and the way that we tell stories in order to be expansive, in order to add to this shared collection of stories rather than to be prescriptive and keep it small.
Right. Myth making, myth telling is
Mm,
very much part of that, as it relies more on the magic than it does anything else. And
mm,
it involves that. What is your experience from it? One example that I will tend to give about myths, because a lot of people are like, well, myths, that means it's a lie. That means it's untrue. And it's like, well, part of it is, and
yeah.
part of it is very, very true.
Mm,
One example is Tiamat. Tiamat was the Babylonian myth of the creator of the whole world. She was this goddess, and she was this angry kind of serpent being, almost a dragon, but a lot of different, kind of animals. Anything scary, basically, anything scary put together. Tiamat. But she was watching this battle with her husband and this battle with her sons, and she started crying. And when she started crying, she created the Euphrates River. And then when she laid dying from her heartbreak, she whipped her tail and it created the Milky Way. And it was this idea of like, well, it's not true, but what does that evoke in you? Does
mm,
that evoke in you from sadness came a way of life, the river, and a beautiful thing to look at in the sky. So it isn't meant to be, you know what I mean, these rules and this truthness, but it is meant to evoke, how do I make meaning of the things around me? And
yes.
so from that can be sadness makes beauty too.
Mm,
Yeah. And sometimes the people that we love are beasts and our mothers.
mm.
Because Tiamat had many children. So it was one of those things where it's like mom's ugly, mean, and angry, but she's also our mom. Like, you know what I mean? Nuance, if you will.
Yeah, that is such a great example. And it's making me think of something else. Have you happened to have read the book Cassandra Speaks?
No, I haven't.
Oh my God.
Is it based on a Greek myth? Okay.
It's
Yes.
Elizabeth Lesser, I
Oh.
think, is the author, and she talks about Cassandra, but also a number of other myths about women, and talks about, kind of part of what this conversation is about, of
Hmm.
what effect has it had on us that these are the stories that we hear about
Right.
women.
Yeah. These are the ones that are highlighted. And it's like, wait a minute.
Exactly. Right. These are the stars we can
Virgin
see.
stories, victim stories. Wait a
Thank you.
second.
Exactly. And I see a kind of parallel in this conversation to the way that people think and talk about communication. Like I said, people think it's this abstract thing. And so I think for people that aren't me and didn't study communication and don't think about it 24/7, it feels like this very abstract thing of, I can't even begin to grasp that. I wouldn't even know where to start. So kind of why
But
bother? And
but it's something we do all the time, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And that's how I think about people maybe relate to thinking more deeply about women's stories, or also I could
Mhm.
even go in general thinking about the stories that we hear and tell and don't tell, period. It's kind of this abstract, like, well, how do stories affect me? I don't really get it.
Mm-hmm.
Or why do I feel the way that I feel? Because this myth thousands of years ago about this woman, and that shapes me and how I am now. What? Like, it's confusing.
It does.
It's big. It feels so big to try to grasp. But again, it's that, like, I think such worthwhile work to try, at least, to lean into that, lean into that mystery, try to, sit in the complexity. Because I just, again, like, oversimplified stories, oversimplified anything, I think is just a disservice to us. I understand why we tend to do it, because it's so hard to sit in the complexity of things.
Or a finite amount of time. I mean, even thinking of, like, how Twitter used to be 150 characters. How do you tell a full, feeling, expression, story in that? And so when we're limited in time and space, we become these really stories.
Yeah. And a big part of, you could talk about communication, you could talk about being in conversation, you could talk about being in dialogue. And I like the idea of being in dialogue, because the definition that I understand that to be is that you are existing in this tension of being profoundly open to other people, their thoughts, their feelings, their ways of being, while also, holding your own. You're not shrinking because you are being open to other people's ways of being. It's this both and of these both can exist. I can be in this tension. And
that's
again,
a good way to think of it. And it's engagement. You're bouncing off of one another of, is it like this? Or you made me think of this. Oh, wait, what about? And you kind of elevate and expand the conversation and the idea.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
It's that expansiveness. I love it. That's incredible. Okay. On the expansiveness train, something I'm curious if you have any of, your own stories or things that people have told you or things that you've seen. We've both spoken to, what it means for us to share women's stories, but I'm curious about what impact you've seen it have on people who come to any of the many events you do, or come to the library, listen to the podcast, or part of your community in any way. What kind of impact have you seen it have on people?
It's one of those things where I've always been bad at compliments. I tend to forget them immediately after they're said, because I don't want to hold on to any, ego-ness or anything like that. So what I love to see is the long game. We have been open as a public library for 4 years. And I have seen people who started coming when we were just kind of like, oh, well, this is history. This is novel. I want to be part of the first. I'm totally a feminist. Rah, 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 rah. And then I start to see them soften and actually have it become more about how they are evolving. So it's less about, females have history and they have to be shared and we have to tell everybody these stories too. This story moved me so much, and I have to tell you how it moved me. So I've seen it gone from a social banner that people want to wear to a innermost cave that has been nurturing to them, that has, like, a slow burn, if you will, that has made them open their eyes to see women's history as different, but also allowed them to see themselves as different and evolving and changing and getting better. So that's what I love. I love to see them come in with one reason. And then as they kind of interact with any of the clubs or the books, or just being in a space where it's judgment free, where women are categorized by their first name. They are not put in boxes of science, science, religion. They're allowed to be many different things and to tell their story in their own words. And if their story is not written in their own words, to be able for us to say, so we read this book on Hedy Lamarr, and the guy who wrote it really liked the technology and didn't care about her life. But if you watch this documentary, you can actually hear Hedy Lamarr speak about her own life in her own words. So take both. You know what I mean? Like, find that nuance between the two, or don't. Read something, and however you are absorbing it is how you're supposed to absorb it in that moment. And you could read it again 10 years from now and get something completely different. And that is okay too. It's seeing that evolution, if you will. we've gotten some amazing compliments of the fact of, I didn't know that there was 5 female scientists. I could barely name 5 female filmmakers.
Yeah.
I had no idea that movie was directed by a woman. You know what I mean? Sometimes
Mhm.
it's those little victories that I will sometimes take of, oh, you were mindful that, especially I will talk about film because that was my previous life, if you will, my previous
Yeah.
existence, where only 5% of female filmmakers existed in Hollywood. And that's 5%. And there's not that many movies that are released. There's about 200 to 300 movies that are released. Take 5%. That's not many.
Not a lot at all.
Right.
Wow.
So when we have something like Barbie and we have Greta Gerwig and we have Patty Jenkins, who directed the Wonder Woman 1 and 2 movies, and they're breaking these records, I'm very, very excited for that breaking of that glass ceiling and of that triumph and of those records.
Mhm.
But what I get most excited about and what I end up talking about and what I talk about here at the library and what people bring in is how Wonder Woman moved them, how Barbie moved them. And so it's still about the content and about the emotional reaction to it, but it's got to start with something. So a book, a media,
Yeah.
we're kind of a conduit into that larger inner conversation. And so I wrote a piece that is going to be coming out in the Gals Guide anthology, which is about holding spaces open. A lot of time what I do is just I hold a space open and I let people be whatever they need to be in that moment in a space. And safe spaces always get used as it's a safe space. You know, it's a space where I'm letting somebody be vulnerable and I'm letting somebody be broken and I'm telling them that it's completely okay because tomorrow might be completely different and it might be the same, but I love them regardless. And that's that kind of space that I try to hold open. I also say books don't judge. So you can hate a book, you can throw it across the room. That book don't care. I mean, it has no opinion about you whatsoever. So books are a great thing. And so I just try to embody that as well of I'm not judging.
Mhm.
So I hope that kind of roundaboutly answers in
Beautiful.
a very kind of Yoda way. Sorry.
No, that was wonderful. And I want to ask to dig a little deeper
Yeah.
in just to know what your experience has been about what it means to share women's stories, not just for women. I'm such a big believer of like, if we're, sharing more women's stories, if we're uplifting women more, that is better for everybody.
Absolutely. We have had people who have joked that come like right to the edge of the library who are dudes that'll say, so am I allowed to enter this women's history library? And I'm like, the books are for everybody.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they are trying to be silly, but there is some truth to it.
Yes.
There is this feel of if you are not identifying as a female, that it is not for you. That is not our case. That is that perception where we feel like certain boxes are labeled and only those that fit that certain label are allowed to engage with it. And so that's something we've mindfully really kind of gone against, where it's like, this is our niche, this is our focus, this is our spotlight, but everybody can learn from it. And they can learn something new and different that is tailored for them specifically. Sometimes I've had this situation where my face and my being reminds somebody of somebody they don't like. Sometimes I will remind somebody of an aunt they didn't get along with, or a mother figure, or a sister, or something. Can I do anything about that? It's the same thing with having a women's history lending library. Some people are going to be averted to it and think, that's not for me. Rawr, 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 I'm out of there. That is fine. But we're still going to be here. And if you change your mind, you're more than welcome. Because it's learning something new. It's a new story that you haven't heard about. Maybe you like geeking out about things. This is definitely something to geek out about, which is quite nice.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm very sarcastic and I'll be like, okay, cool. So, name me 5 scientists. You know what I mean? Like I'll just challenge them downright with it and be like, cool. How many Supreme Court justices have been female? Like, you should know this. How many women are on the money? You know what I mean? It's just little things that it's like, well, I never really thought about that before. Of course you didn't.
Yeah.
That's why the library is here. So you at least have that entered into your conversation. And I hate to call out my husband. I'm going to call out my husband for a second. So my husband, he has a USB drive. He loves to listen to music, listens to music quite a bit. He has like probably upwards of 1,000 songs on his USB. And we're always traveling. We drive a lot when we travel. We love to listen to music. And I just kind of turned to him and I finally said it. I said, you don't have many women on your USB. I didn't want to call out my own husband, y'all. I live with him. Okay.
You have to.
But I'm in a female space and I'm used to and getting used to having that female voice around.
Mm-hmm.
And so I realized I was starting to get kind of tense and feeling kind of out of place. And we had been in the car for 3 days. And I'm like, you don't have my, and then he's trying to name them. He's like, no, hold on. I have, it's his own playlist. And he was struggling to see. And I hated mentioning it, but you know what? I mentioned it and he's like, okay, hold on. I need to get more of Sister Rosetta Tharpe on here. I need to get more of Big Mama Thornton on here. He started to realize that there had a lot of love of women musicians, but he didn't put them in the space of his USB to be in his circle.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's as simple as just saying, do you watch any media or read any books written by women?
Yes.
Sometimes just that challenging. Yeah.
That's so important. You're making me think of, one of these things that's like, that's silly. And also, wow, what a big bummer. I'm not even on TikTok, but I know that this is a trend of girls will like record their boyfriend and be like, name 5 women.
Yes.
They're like, I got nothing.
Right. Because sometimes it's these filters of I'm not supposed to see anything feminine.
Yeah. Right.
And it's like, whoa, that's half the world.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I'm like, this is one of those things where you're like, haha, funny, like
right.
Class, whatever.
Exactly.
But also I'm like, wow, what a huge bummer that's the reality that we live in, which again, no, it's just a little goofy little thing, but I think that speaks to something real. I love that you bring up the music. I very proud of myself. Like I bragged about it to my boyfriend this year that I was like, look at my Spotify Wrapped. My top 5 artists are all women. That was intentional because last year I was like, I want to listen to more women. And so I have this playlist that, partially intentionally, partially just happened that way is like all women artists. And I'm even conscious of like, I want to be listening to songs that are not about a man.
Right.
I want to be listening to songs by women, but not just, love songs. Like I want to hear women sing about everything. In the experience of what it means to be a woman. I want to see movies. I want to read books about everything that it means to be a woman.
Yeah.
It's so expansive. And it can be if we allow it to be. Yeah.
Right. And sometimes it is seeing that top 5 that, you know what I mean, that is all male because my girl Bonnie, who is the president of the Gals Guide board, she always says the default is male.
I was about to say exactly that.
It's just the default. And it's not necessarily anybody's fault. It just happens to be the gatekeepers of culture and society have been men. And so we see the default as, well, these are the male artists. These are the, male stories. This is when I went to college to learn screenplay writing, not any of them were necessarily about writing a female character. It was the hero's journey, and the hero's journey meant a white dude saving the princess. Like, so the default of even what I had learned was this makes a good story. This is the way that you tell stories is seen through a male lens. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that there's half of us that feel left out.
Yep.
And if we told a different story, maybe all of us could grow in a new way.
Yes.
Because it elevate. What is it? All waters, you know what I mean? Rise. So yes, it's that elevating all of us to a different and a better way of storytelling and learning about the world. And also, what was it? NBC had that. It's new to you. Remember, if you hadn't seen a rerun, it's new to you. Well, if you haven't heard a woman's song, story, or movie, it's new to you.
Yes. Yes. Leah, you are saying such amazing things. And it's too late in the podcast for it to be stirring up so many new ideas for me. But I think that default thing is so important. And so I think it's, we could talk forever probably about it, but I think it's okay to let's leave people with that to ruminate on it. But because I see that so much in my own experience. Even one little example I think about is probably really any TV show, but I think about children's shows where there's kind of this default of okay, well, there's 2 boys and a girl and they're the friend group, or there's 3 boys and a girl and that's the friend group. And if there was a majority of girls, then it's a girl show.
Right.
But I grew up watching all the shows with the little boys. It's I think as women, we are practiced in seeing ourselves in male characters, male stories, the hero's journey, because that's the way it's set up right now, with men as the default, women be like, okay, let me
Mhm.
stretch myself a little bit to see myself here. Men are not practicing themselves in women. And that's why books about women, books for women, books by women, stories, movies,
Mhm.
any of it about women,
Yeah.
it's not, they're like, oh, that's women. That's why men stand outside your library and go, that's might not be for me. I
Can
don't
I
think.
come in? Or some of them are like, oh, hell yeah.
Yeah, right.
Here's a space where I don't have to go through and be like, is this a good book? It's like, no, 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 no. The girl's already said it's good. So I'm like, I'm in. You know what I mean?
Awesome.
Like,
Yeah.
it's already curated. And totally to bounce off that super quick, I was born in a Star Wars universe. I was born in 77. The first movie I ever saw was Star Wars.
Oh, wow.
I loved Luke Skywalker. I wanted to be Luke Skywalker, but my name is Leah. Does that sound familiar? Princess Leia. So for a lot of my life, I kind of
Mm,
protested and kind of had this edge against this princess who was, always falling down, pew, pew, pew. You know what I
yeah.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
but I'm like, no, can I just be Luke? Can I be Luke? But now I live in a time where my daughters got Rey
Yay.
and my daughters got Ahsoka. And that
Wow.
is that slow burn. That
Yeah.
is that evolution of, yeah. So the narrative was this, but now it's this. And
Yeah.
people still hate it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But I love it. I
Yeah.
love that Rey and Ahsoka get to exist in this complex, beautiful universe of good and bad.
Hmm.
And they're right there in between. They are that edge that is neither necessarily pure good or pure evil. And it's wonderful because that's what everybody should be learning, not just girls, but all of us. So yeah,
Yeah. Wow.
I love Star Wars. What can I say? I even have my Princess Leia water bottle.
I love it.
We have made amends, me and Princess Leia, Carrie Fisher. We have made amends, but when I was young, not so much.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Leah, wonderful. I've so loved this conversation. Before we wrap up, no pressure if there's nothing else, but I just like to give this space. Anything else that you want to say about your work and the things you're passionate about?
If you've enjoyed any of this, go to galsguide.org. Interact
Yeah.
with us, whether it's through a podcast or whether it's coming in, just interact with us. We have a space open for you and we would love to help you out.
And you are allowed to walk in the door no matter who you are.
Everybody is welcome. Everybody.
Awesome. Okay, that is all for our conversation with Leah. At the end of each episode, you know that I like to offer some questions to reflect on as our next turn. The purpose of this is so that the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode did. Today, the questions I would have you think about based on this conversation are: how can we seek to tell and hear stories that encourage empathy-based communication? And also, where can you seek out more or new to you information about women in history? I hope you'll do some reflecting on the questions I've just asked, as well as some questions that Leah mentioned during our conversation. How many women scientists do you know? How many women filmmakers do you know? How many women do you know in history? For many of us, we know less than we would like to admit. So I would like to give you this opportunity to take it upon yourself to search out that information, because there are resources out there like Gal's Guide that are making the information more readily available for all of us. Okay, so you can reach out to me to share your reflections to those questions if you'd like. I'm also happy to hear any of your own questions or ideas that came up from this conversation. You can do that through email, through the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. Links to all those are in the show notes. The reason that I invite you to share your reflection with me is to stay in dialogue. I mentioned that at the very top of the episode as part of our approach, as part of what it means to take a communication perspective. So we really value dialogue here. Some other great ways to keep dialogue going is to follow the show wherever you listen, so you're not missing any new episodes. It's also very helpful if you can leave a rating and a review, because that helps us to grow our community. But most importantly to me is for you to share this episode or any episode that you've found meaningful so far, so that we can continue to invite more people into this community. So you can easily share episodes through texts, but also on social media. If you do that, you can tag me on Instagram at Stories Lived, Stories Told Pod. And on LinkedIn, you can tag me at CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. Okay, speaking of which, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is actually just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations, which move us toward those better social worlds we hope to create, right? That's the goal at the center of all of this. So you can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives at the links in the show notes. So thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.